Hi there, I'm Emily Muhlstein with the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council, and this is a public hearing video designed to gather your comments on Coral Amendment 9, which considers coral habitat areas for management in the Gulf. So coral reef ecosystems are among some of the most diverse ecosystems in the world. Specifically, deep water corals are long-lived and they provide really important habitat to many of our fish and invertebrates in the Gulf of Mexico. There's two main federal partners that are responsible for protection of corals in the Gulf. First, the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council, which is responsible for the conservation and management of coral resources in federal waters. Next, NOAA, through the Office of Marine Sanctuaries, conserves and manages special areas of the marine environment. In the Gulf, they do that through two marine protected areas. There's Flower Garden Banks off the coast of Texas, and also the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. It's been a long road to get where we're at. Initially, we started with a group of scientists who identified 47 areas in the Gulf that are in need of protection. After hearing from those scientists, the Gulf Council consulted with a number of its different advisory panels, and those initial 47 areas were narrowed down to 15 priority areas that are in need of fishing regulations and protections. And they also identified 8 additional areas that were recommended to be considered habitat areas of particular concern, but without any sort of fishing restrictions. So the Gulf Council's main option for protecting our corals is through designation or redefinition of a habitat area of particular concern. Now that's reserved for areas that are ecologically important, sensitive to human harm, or located in a stressed area or considered rare. The designation of habitat area of particular concern allows the councils to regulate fishing activity, and then other activities that may be affecting the area would require a NOAA consultation process. So we'll jump right into the actions, starting with Action 1, which looks at modifying the current Pulley Ridge habitat area of particular concern boundary for regulations purposes. So Pulley Ridge was established in 2005. Pulley Ridge North, which is the large rectangular box on this map, has no fishing regulations. In Pulley Ridge South, fishing with bottom longline, bottom trawl, buoy gear, pot, or trap, and bottom anchoring are all prohibited. And the council is considering changing the area that is managed with regulations or potentially adding new area with modified regulations as well. So this map, as you can see, is not only of the areas being considered, but it also overlays the vessel monitoring system data from the commercial fishery in the Gulf, and you can see the extent to which the area has been fished. The first alternative is the no action alternative, so that would not modify the existing Pulley Ridge boundaries or regulations. Alternative 2 would expand the fishing regulations that are currently in existence for Pulley Ridge South to the entire Pulley Ridge North habitat area of particular concern. Alternative 3 would modify the existing Pulley Ridge South habitat area of particular concern to include Pulley Ridge South Portion A with the same regulations throughout. And finally, Alternative 4, which is the council's preferred alternative, would add a new area, which would be that Pulley Ridge South Portion A, and create separate regulations. The regulations would prohibit fishing with bottom trawl, buoy gear, pot or trap, and bottom anchoring by fishing vessels all year round. And just an important note here, in this action, as well as in the actions that we talk about in the future, buoy gear does not include HMS buoy gear. So next we move on to Action 2, which considers new areas for the designation of habitat areas of particular concern in the southeastern Gulf region. So the council is considering 3 areas in this region that are along the West Florida shelf. All 3 of the areas are between 100 and 500 fathoms deep, so pretty deep. And all 3 areas have confirmed presence of deep water, stony, and black corals. Now, none of the areas being considered here in this region are frequently visited by vessels with bottom tending gear. And you can see that if you look at the map and then the overlay of both the shrimp data and the commercial fishing data. So our first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would not establish any new habitat areas of particular concern in this region. The second alternative, which is a preferred alternative, would establish the long mound habitat area of particular concern. The third alternative, which is also a preferred, would establish the many mounds habitat area of particular concern. And then the fourth alternative, which is also a preferred, would establish North Reed habitat area of particular concern. Now for alternatives 2 through 4, which are all of the preferred alternatives in this action, we could, for option A, not establish fishing regulations, or the preferred option for all three would be option B, and that would prohibit bottom tending gear, which is defined as bottom longline, bottom trawl, buoy gear, dredge, pot or trap, and also bottom anchoring by fishing vessels. Moving to action 3, we're considering creating new areas for habitat area of particular concern status in the northeastern Gulf region. So there are 6 areas being considered here. This region is characterized by hard bottom that's made of fossil reefs and pinnacles with patch reefs. Banded gear fishermen and shrimpers pretty regularly fish in this region. There's only one area that is currently used for royal red shrimping. And here you'll see the map overlay of the commercial vessel monitoring system data, along with those 6 areas being considered. So our first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would not establish any new areas of particular concern in this region. Our second alternative, which is a preferred alternative, would establish a new habitat area of particular concern named Alabama Alps Reef. We could choose option A, which would be to not establish fishing regulations. The Council's current preferred is option B, which would prohibit bottom tending gear, including bottom longline, bottom trawl, buoy gear, dredge, pot or trap, and bottom anchoring by fishing vessels. Or we can consider option C, which would prohibit bottom longline, bottom trawl, buoy gear, dredge, and pots or traps. Next alternative is alternative 3, which is also a preferred alternative, and that would establish a new habitat area of particular concern named L&W Pinnacles and Scamp Reef. So again, here we could choose option A, which would not create any new fishing regulations. The Council's current preferred is option B, which would prohibit bottom tending gear entirely. And then we could consider option C, which would simply prohibit bottom longline, bottom trawl, buoy gear, dredge, and pots or traps. So alternative 4 is also a preferred alternative, and that would establish a new habitat area of particular concern named Mississippi Canyon. Now we could choose not to establish fishing regulations through option A, or the Council's current preferred would prohibit bottom tending gear. Now alternative 5, which is another preferred alternative under this action, would establish a habitat area of particular concern named Rough Tongue Reef. Option A, we could select to not establish any fishing regulations in this area. The Council has selected preferred alternative B, which would prohibit bottom tending gear entirely. Or they could look at considering option C, which would prohibit bottom longline, bottom trawl, buoy gear, dredge, and pots or traps. Next, we move on to alternative 6, which is a Council preferred, and that considers establishing a new habitat area of particular concern named Viosca Knoll 826. So we could select not to establish fishing regulations, or we could select option B, which is the Council's current preferred, and that would prohibit bottom tending gear. Finally, looking at alternative 7, which is another preferred alternative by the Council, we could establish a new habitat area of particular concern named Viosca Knoll 862-906. So option A, we could select not to establish fishing regulations. We could select option B, which would prohibit bottom tending gear. Or we could select option C, which is the Council's current preferred, which would prohibit bottom tending gear, but provide an exemption to the bottom tending gear for fishermen that possess a Royal Red Shrimp endorsement and are fishing with Royal Red shrimping gear. Now we'll move over to the Northwestern Gulf in Action 4, where we're considering 3 new areas for habitat area of particular concern status. Now all 3 of the areas in this region that are being considered are very deep. The region has hard bottom salt domes and shallow water banks, and there is very little shrimping and almost no fishing with bottom tending gear in these areas. So alternative 1 is the no action alternative. Alternative 2, which is a council preferred alternative, would establish a new habitat area of particular concern named AT047. Preferred alternative 3 would establish a new habitat area of particular concern named AT357. And then alternative 4, which is also a council preferred, would establish a new HAP-C named Green Canyon 852. Now for alternatives 2 through 4, which are all preferreds currently, we could not establish regulations through option A, or we could select option B, which would prohibit bottom tending gear. Next, we'll move over to the southwestern Gulf, where the council is considering 2 new areas for habitat area of particular concern status. Both areas under consideration contain reefs that are 2.5 to 5 million years old, and fishing with bottom tending gear is relatively low in these areas. So our first alternative is the no action alternative. Our second alternative, which is a preferred, would establish a new habitat area of particular concern named the Heart Bank. And our third alternative, which is also a preferred, would establish a new habitat area of particular concern named the Southern Bank. Now for both alternatives 2 and 3, we could consider option A, which is currently the council's preferred, which would not establish fishing regulations in these areas. Or we can consider option B, which would prohibit bottom tending gear in these areas. So finally, we'll move to action 6, which looks at new areas for habitat area of particular concern status without fishing regulations. So the council is currently considering 8 new areas. All of those areas are in depths that are unlikely to be fished with bottom tending gear, and all of those areas contain unique coral communities that are rare. So our first alternative is the no action alternative. Our second alternative, which is a preferred, would establish South Reed as a HAP-C. Our third alternative, which is a council preferred, would establish Garden Banks 299 as a HAP-C. Our fourth alternative, which is a preferred, would establish Garden Banks 535 as a HAP-C. Alternative 5, which is also a preferred, would establish Green Canyon 104 and 272 as a habitat area of particular concern. Alternative 6, again a preferred, would establish Green Canyon 203 as a new habitat area of particular concern. Alternative 7, again a preferred, would establish Green Canyon 354 as a HAP-C. And finally, alternative 8 would establish Mississippi Canyon 751 as a new habitat area of particular concern. Now next, we'll take a look at action 7, which considers prohibiting dredging on all existing HAP-Cs with fishing regulations. So currently, those existing habitat areas of particular concern do not prohibit dredging, but do prohibit bottom tending gear. So bottom tending gear is defined as bottom longline, bottom trawl, buoy gear, dredge, pot or trap, and bottom anchoring by fishing vessels. The west and east Florida Garden Banks habitat area of particular concern, Florida Middle Grounds, and Tortugas Marine Reserve all have prohibitions on bottom tending gear, which include dredging within their boundaries. However, Pulley Ridge, Stetson Bank, McGrail Bank only prohibit longlining, bottom trawl, buoy gear, pot or trap, and bottom anchoring. There is no explicit prohibition on dredging. The council could take no action and leave things as they are, or they could decide to prohibit dredging in all existing habitat areas of particular concern that have fishing regulations. And that would be alternative 2, which is currently the council's preferred alternative. So we know there's a lot in this amendment. The council would really like to hear your thoughts and your comments before they take final action in the spring. So you can either give us comments by going online and submitting comments to our online comment form, or you can simply email us your comments at golfcouncil@golfcouncil.org. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this presentation and to send us your thoughts.